Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about vassalization and the sheer absurd power it can give you in any particular campaign. Though this is specifically about diplomatic vassalization that the undead factions, specifically the Tomb Kings and Vampire Counts, do have access to, not forced vassalization like Nakari or the Warriors of Chaos do have. But what is forced vassalization is it is when you reduce a faction to its last settlement, you take it over, and you can subjugate them. Whereas diplomatic vassalization is going to a faction and convincing them to become your vassal. There are multiple ways of doing it, but typically speaking, it isn't a wise idea to get involved in a war with them. Rather, in point of fact, getting involved with a faction diplomatically might be the best way possible, though not selling a territory unless that territory is going to grant you that vassalization agreement. In this particular campaign as Heinrich Kemmler, I've become the true lord of the empire in Bretonnia, so I vassalized Crix, the Celestial Loyalists. Don't ask me how that has happened. Well, it's because I declared war on the factions they were at war with, and when I finally declared war on Lokir, I'm never going to fight Lokir, and they've been reduced to their last territory, and they agreed to become my vassal, is a bit of an absurd situation, I gotta say. Then you have Grom the Punch, as well as a vassal, though all of these actions have pissed off Musalon, and they're probably not going to be happy for a very, very long time with me. I could probably beat up the Red Duke even more than I already have in this campaign. I already had a war with him in order to force him to bend the knee, so to speak, towards me. But how did I manage this, and why is this so very useful? Well, suffice to say, I have Grom the Paunch as my vassal. He's been kicked around by the Fey Enchantress, surprisingly, in this particular campaign, who defeated several of his armies. She's got a lot more durability than you might think, but Grom is on the upswing, and once I take Brionne and march on Castle Carcassonne with this army over here, I will certainly be able to really help out Grom in this particular campaign. But how do you manage it? Well, as I said, diplomatic dealings. If a faction has suffered significantly and its strength has been reduced, they might be willing to accept becoming your vassal, especially if they're not at war with you and you already have good, positive relations with them. But on top of that, there is a nice little nifty trick that you do have available in any campaign where you can use diplomacy in order to get a vassalization agreement. And that trick is regarding landmarks. So, Bordelot has a unique port in it, the Bordelot port. So I was thinking to myself as I was playing this Kemmler campaign that I decided to play, for the sake of the tier list, just to figure out where I really want to place Kemmler. And one of the things I realized is, hold on a second, the campaign starts me over here at war with Artois and wants me to go for basically Castle Artois from the very start. That's the most logical expansion path. I decided to break the mold. What I did in this particular campaign is to Castle Baston, and I went to Carrick Ziflin, which starts a war with Baston, and asked them to pay me to declare war on Baston, took the settlement. I didn't immediately give them the settlement, but because my diplomatic relations with them were on the upswing because of the war, because of my actions against Baston, they were eventually willing to vassalize in exchange for the territory. I still don't have a trade agreement with them, probably never will, given my poor relations, but minor factions generally aren't worth vassalizing, unless they're the dwarves. The reason the dwarves are useful as vassals is because their individual armies are really good. So many factions have armies with poor auto-resolve results, which obviously affects the AI. The dwarves, every single dwarven unit, especially the early ones, are heavily armored. So this army right here, even though it's a fairly basic army, would do very, very well in auto-resolve. In fact, it has been an army of Carrick Ziflin. I think that their initial army got wiped out, but it has been one of their armies that actually managed to push the Fey Enchantress back, not Grom, the mighty legendary lord of the Greenskins. In fact, he actually lost his main army and he has had to rebuild it. AI Grom does struggle in a campaign. But then how did I vassalize Grom is the question. Well, Bordello has a unique port. This unique port is a landmark, and the AI loves landmarks. If you sell the AI a territory like this with this unique port, it's going to count for a lot in any negotiation, right? It's going to count for a significant amount when we're looking at the value here. Like, for instance, here, the deal evaluation, if I wanted Bordello from Grom, would be 176. That's how much it was, or over 100 it was worth when I was trading it to Grom. Because what Grom will do on any difficulty is he'll take Aquitaine and then he'll spend a couple of turns recruiting goblins, really, before he decides to march on Bordello. And what I was able to do is I was able to take Baston and then march on Bordello to race him before he arrived, and then take the city and sell it to Grom, and he agreed to become my vassal in exchange. A similar thing played out with Karl Franz over here, because Marienburg, as you might imagine it, Marienburg also has a landmark port. And because of that, I was able to vassalize Karl Franz. That's the trick. Landmark settlements are worth a lot, especially if you do have the landmark built in them. Like, you have to have the landmark, but because the port is always there, Karl Franz agreed to become my vassal. Not necessarily the best vassal in the world, though if he were to take Nuln and start getting artillery, he would become quite a bit more powerful and useful in this particular campaign. I realized this initially when I was dealing with the situation over here in this particular corner of the map. And one of the things I found is that I could play any faction in this area. It didn't matter who I was talking about. Like, could be Arkan as the servant of Nagash, could be Cetra, could be even Manfred. But if I took the Great Desert of Araby and built the tier 1 landmark here, then I could vassalize Rapans, for instance, who Shut-Haytan did, but it didn't matter. So I was able to vassalize her and make her a formidable ally in my campaign. And there's a great deal of power in having a vassal, beyond the fact that it's very easy to get allegiance points with them in any particular campaign, and thus give them orders or even request armies in their campaign. Like, looking here at Grom, I do have a decent amount of allegiance points with him, but beyond the allegiance points, it's also a portion of their income. Now, none of the factions here necessarily have a great deal of income. None of the vassals I currently have are actually generating a significant amount of income. Grom, because he has very little territory, Reichland, because it only has its initial province. But if they were to build up, I would be earning a significant amount of money. But on top of that, as Kemmler specifically, since you do start with the Northern Green Mountains, which are split between various factions, and fighting the dwarves early on as the vampire counts may not necessarily be the easiest thing in the world. Because, yeah, later on, once you get a Great Guard, you have the options of dealing with them, but early on might be an issue. But if you have a vassal faction and you're splitting a province with them, then you can still use commandments, which is actually quite important in this particular case, because I do need commandments in order to grow my settlement over here. And that is actually a fairly significant benefit from having vassals. And this gives you a ridiculous level of power, if you manage them. Now, I think that once you get either a military alliance or a vassalization agreement, the faction becomes less strong. And I'm not talking here in the sense that the portion of their income goes to you. It feels like they just end up being nerfed in comparison to their previous potential on the campaign map. Like, Grom can conquer all of Bretonnia on his own if you let him. And here the Fey Enchantress has just kicked him out. It's only because Ikeclaw has been arriving over here that she's actually pulled back, and even then, not completely. But it is certainly interesting to see the ridiculous potential in a campaign because of vassalization, because looking at this situation, there is no chance that Blackstone Post is ever going to come under threat in this particular campaign, considering that I've got the ring vassals, like between Reichland, the dwarves, and Grom, to protect my territory. I mean, when Grom is your vassal, you're in pretty good hands, all things considered. Anyway, that's all there is to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.